fire is raging in Ottawa, Canada. This second fire has the potential to fundamentally reshape one of the most significant relationships on the planet. This is the story of a prime minister who made one of the most perilous and contradictory foreign policy decisions in recent Canadian history, faced backlash from within his own party, attempted to walk it back, and now finds himself trapped between the fury of Donald Trump on one side and the outrage of his own Liberal MPs on the other. In the next 20 minutes, I will detail how this situation unfolded, why it matters more than anything else you've read this week, and what it reveals about the impossible choices every Democratic government is now forced to confront in the age of Trump. Let's rewind to the morning of February 28, 2026. Just after midnight in Washington, Donald Trump releases an 8-minute video on Truth Social announcing that the United States and Israel have launched coordinated military operations against Iran, dubbed Operation Epic Fury. Bombs are falling on Tehran, Isfahan, Karaj, and Kermanshah. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei has been assassinated, and the Middle East is ablaze. Every government on Earth scrambles to formulate a response. In London, Keir Starmer hedges his bets. In Paris, Macron opts for diplomatic language. In Berlin, Friedrich Merz remains mostly silent. In Madrid, Pedro Sanchez goes on national television and clearly states no to war. Most European leaders choose some version of restraint, neutrality, or cautious distance. Then there's Canada. The Canadian Prime Minister was in India at the time, engaged in a trade and diplomatic mission with Prime Minister Narendra Modi when news of the strikes reached him. The statement released from Ottawa that morning, jointly from the Prime Minister and Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand, was anything but cautious. According to reporting from CBC News and Policy Magazine, the joint statement read, "Canada supports the United States acting to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon and to prevent its regime from further threatening international peace and security. Canada reaffirms Israel's right to defend itself. Canada has long seen Iran as the principal source of instability and terror throughout the Middle East. The regime and its proxies have murdered hundreds of Canadian civilians." Let that sink in. While France expressed concern, Spain said no to war, and Germany remained mostly silent. Canada, under a new prime minister who had recently delivered a celebrated speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos about defending the rules-based international order, came out in unequivocal support of Donald Trump's military actions against Iran. Not with caveats or legal reservations, not calling for UN authorization, but with clear, official governmental backing. Then the phone lines in Ottawa started ringing. Announcement number 1, the rebellion from inside the House. The backlash was immediate and came from the most uncomfortable direction possible, from within the Liberal tent. Lloyd Axworthy, a respected and senior figure in the Liberal Party of Canada and former Foreign Affairs Minister, who helped create the Ottawa Treaty banning landmines, published a scathing op-ed within hours of the statement. Axworthy did not hold back. He stated that the Prime Minister was abandoning Canada's commitment to preventing aggressive war and merely endorsing Trump's obsession with imperial power. He described it as the worst situation for Canada and drew a comparison to 2003, the defining moment of Canadian foreign policy independence, when Prime Minister Jean Chrétien stood before the House of Commons and declared that Canada would not join the invasion of Iraq because it lacked UN authorization. That decision is now celebrated as a cornerstone of Canadian sovereignty. Axworthy asserted that the current Prime Minister was doing the opposite, siding with Trump when Chrétien had chosen to uphold international law. Axworthy also emphasized that Iran is not an isolated case, noting that this attack marked the 7th country against which President Trump has ordered unilateral military action while in office: Venezuela, Syria, and now Iran in the most dramatic operation yet. Axworthy argued that a middle power like Canada, which has historically defined its identity by championing international law and multilateral institutions, should be vocally opposing this pattern. Instead, the Prime Minister was waving the flag in support of it. That was just the beginning. Liberal MP Will Greaves, a former professor of international relations newly elected to the House of Commons, posted a viral video on Instagram. He stated, "Canada cannot endorse the unilateral and illegal use of military force, the killing of civilians, or the assassination of foreign heads of government, while also insisting that Canada's own sovereignty, rights, and independence must be respected." This statement carried specific weight, as he was not just addressing Iran, but also referencing Canada itself. Greaves highlighted that Trump has repeatedly threatened to annex Canada, referred to it as the 51st state, and imposed tariffs aimed at crippling the Canadian economy, making it clear that he views Canadian sovereignty as conditional upon compliance. Greaves pointed out the glaring contradiction. You cannot endorse a president who kills foreign leaders without authorization and expect that same president to respect your borders and laws. The video garnered support from a wave of fellow Liberal MPs, former Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault, Jeanette Levac, Patrick Weiler, and Samir Zibri, all Liberals and members of the Prime Minister's parliamentary coalition, publicly expressed their discomfort. NP leader Don Davies joined in, stating that endorsing illegality, violence, and destruction over dialogue and peaceful resolution was not what Canadians were promised and is not what they support. This marked a political crisis within the Prime Minister's own coalition. And it gets even more chaotic. While all of this was unfolding, Axworthy writing, Liberal MPs posting, and the NP condemning, three senior Canadian officials sent three completely different messages to the world on the same day. The Prime Minister backed the strikes. Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand issued a separate statement calling for all parties to prioritize the protection of civilians and return to negotiations. Defense Minister Bill Blair went on television advocating for a ceasefire. Stop. A prime minister supporting the war, a foreign minister calling for diplomacy, and a defense minister advocating for a ceasefire. Three different positions, three conflicting signals, yet one Canadian government. If you are an ally trying to understand Canada's stance, you're experiencing whiplash. If you're a voter trying to comprehend whether your prime minister has a coherent foreign policy, you're left with nothing but confusion. If this analysis resonates with you, hit like and subscribe to the Sarah Mitchell YouTube channel. This is what we do here. Cut through the noise and provide the full, unfiltered story. Announcement number 2, the walk back that wasn't. The Prime Minister had been noticeably avoiding direct questions since the war began, canceling a scheduled press conference in India by claiming his meetings with Modi had run over time. Reporters traveling with him grew increasingly frustrated. Back in Ottawa, the questions multiplied. Finally, on March 3rd, as reported by CBC and confirmed by the official statement on the Government of Canada website, the Prime Minister released an updated position. He added language he had omitted from the first statement, declaring Canada reaffirms that international law binds all belligerents. He also called for rapid de-escalation, urging all parties, including the United States and Israel, to respect the rules of international engagement. However, he maintained his original position, did not retract his support, and did not declare the strikes to be wrong. Instead, he elaborated on his rationale, asserting that his support was not a blank check, nor was it participation. It was a stance taken due to the nuclear threat posed by Iran. On March 4th, while speaking at the Lowy Institute in Sydney, Australia, the Prime Minister made a remarkable admission. As reported by NPR, Fortune, and various international outlets, he stated for the first time on record that Canada supported the strikes with some regret. He characterized the war as an extreme example of a rupturing world order. He acknowledged what critics had been saying since day one, stating, "We were not informed in advance. We were not asked to participate. Prima facie, it appears that these actions are inconsistent with international law." Pause and consider this. A sitting prime minister is publicly stating that his country's closest ally and largest trading partner appears to have initiated an illegal war, a war that he had endorsed just 4 days earlier. Announcement number 3, the answer that changed everything. Then came March 5th, 2026. Standing alongside Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese in Canberra during a joint press conference, the Canadian Prime Minister was asked the question every observer had been waiting for. Would Canada get involved militarily in the Iran war? According to Al Jazeera, CBC, Fox News, and NPR, all reporting the same answer, the Prime Minister replied, "One can never categorically rule out participation." He added that Canada would stand by our allies, stating that the question was hypothetical, but did not outright say no. Let that sink in. The Prime Minister of Canada, on March 5, 2026, refused to rule out sending Canadian soldiers to fight in Donald Trump's war in Iran, a war that he had just claimed appeared to violate international law. This is the trap. As Policy Magazine detailed in its analysis of what they termed Carney's Iran trap, the mechanism of this trap is precise. By endorsing the stated objective of stopping Iran's nuclear program while distancing Canada from the planning of the operation, the Prime Minister has narrowed his options. The moment you express support for the goal, you open the door to being asked to support the means. Trump has already used this playbook against Keir Starmer. When Britain initially refused to allow the United States to utilize British military bases at Diego Garcia and RAF Fairford as staging points for strikes on Iran, Trump publicly compared Starmer unfavorably to Winston Churchill, saying, "This is not Winston Churchill that we are dealing with. This was a calculated humiliation designed to portray the British Prime Minister as weak, cowardly, and unworthy of the alliance." Starmer capitulated, and Britain subsequently agreed to allow the U.S. to use its bases. Trump then turned his attention to Spain. Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez had also refused to permit the United States to use joint military bases for strikes against Iran, stating simply, "No to war," on national television. Trump responded with threats of a full U.S. trade embargo on Spain, a member of the European Union, for its refusal to cooperate with an unauthorized military operation. This is the template that Canada is observing, and this is why the stakes of Canada's strategic ambiguity are so high. The question is not just where Canada stands on Iran today, it's about the broader implications for its foreign policy, its relationship with the United States, and the very principles of international law that Canada has historically championed. The pressing question is what occurs when Trump makes a direct, formal, and personal request. What happens when he calls and states, "I need Canadian personnel, bases, ships, and a public statement, a full military commitment. In exchange, I will protect KSMA, reduce tariffs, and stop referring to Canada as the 51st state"? If the war drags on for weeks or months beyond the 4 to 5 weeks Trump initially promised, that call will inevitably come. As Policy Magazine noted, Trump will cherry-pick and throw the Prime Minister's own words back at him. At Davos in January 2026, Canada's Prime Minister declared that Canada would uphold its commitment to fundamental values, including the prohibition of the use of force unless consistent with the UN Charter. Trump could easily counter, saying, "Iran had nuclear weapons and threatened peace and security. You said so yourself. You supported the objective, now support the operation." What will be the answer? This moment is uniquely painful for the Prime Minister because his political identity is built on a specific set of ideals. He is not a conventional politician. He is an economist, a former governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. He made his name as a technocrat of extraordinary intelligence and global standing. His Davos speech in January 2026 was hailed as one of the most significant foreign policy addresses by any world leader in years. He argued that the old rules-based international order, the post-World War II architecture of the United Nations, the Security Council, international law, and multilateral institutions was not returning. He stated that the world was undergoing a rupture, with hegemons acting without restraint or respect for international norms while others bore the consequences. He claimed that Canada would be a middle power standing on principle, not one that meekly accommodated hegemons. Yet, in March, when the most dramatic example of a hegemon acting without constraint emerged, the joint U.S.-Israeli assassination of a sitting supreme leader without UN authorization, his first instinct was to endorse it. This contradiction has not gone unnoticed. A former diplomat writing shortly after the initial statement pointed out that the prime minister was abandoning the values he championed at Davos the moment they became costly. Legal scholars have noted that the legality of military strikes is not determined by whether the targeted state is an ally or an adversary. Just as the lawfulness of murder is not contingent upon the likability of the victim, if Canada endorses an illegal war against Iran today because it is viewed as odious, it loses its principled ground to object when someone decides to wage an illegal war against a country Canada favors. As one analyst chillingly asked, who is next? Turkey, Cuba, Greenland, or even Canada itself? This is not hyperbole. Trump has openly threatened Canadian sovereignty, called for its annexation, and referred to the previous prime minister as the governor of the great state of Canada. He has imposed sweeping tariffs on Canadian goods and threatened economic devastation unless Canada complies with American demands regarding trade, defense spending, and border policy. Canada is not a random bystander in Trump's imperial vision of a reorganized North America. It is, in Trump's conception, a subordinate entity to be absorbed or coerced. And yet, here is Canada's prime minister in the same week that Iran is being bombed into regime change without UN authorization, refusing to clearly and unequivocally state that the use of force against sovereign nations without UN authorization is wrong, all because he fears what Trump might do to the Canadian economy if he does. The realpolitik calculus has been laid bare by analysts across the political spectrum. One analyst summarized it bluntly: for Canada to oppose or lecture on human rights or international law would be costly. Trump remembers these things. It is a crude calculation, but it reflects the impossible reality the government faces. Canada needs the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, CUSMA, to survive. As analysis has shown, Canadian exports are 90% dependent on access to the American market. The auto sector, energy sector, and agricultural sector, all of it flows south across the border that Trump has already threatened to weaponize. In the Prime Minister's calculation, the cost of endorsing an illegal war against an adversarial state was lower than the cost of publicly rebuking the American president he needs on his side for the next 4 years of trade negotiations. That was the decision made in the early hours of the war. However, the problem with a realist calculation is that reality is fluid. The war that was supposed to conclude in 4 to 5 weeks shows no signs of ending quickly. Iran is retaliating across 15 countries. American soldiers are dead, and more than 1,000 Iranians are estimated to have been killed. Over 100,000 people have been displaced within Iran alone, with 38,000 fleeing into Syria from Lebanon. Dubai International Airport, the busiest in the world for international passengers, has been largely shut down. More than 100,000 Canadians are registered in the region, prompting Canada to scramble for evacuation flights out of Beirut. The Prime Minister personally called the President of the UAE to thank him for protecting 24,500 Canadians in that country. This conflict is not confined to Iran. A British base in Cyprus was struck by a drone, a French facility in Abu Dhabi was targeted, and a base hosting Italian troops in Kuwait was hit. Saudi oil facilities were attacked, and NATO's air defense system intercepted an Iranian missile heading toward Turkish airspace for the first time, protecting a member state. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg referred to Trump as the leader of the free world and endorsed the operation. However, beneath the rhetoric, NATO allies are quietly seething. Jeremy Shapiro of the European Council on Foreign Relations articulated the situation clearly. Allies are in a position where they cannot support the operation, yet they cannot afford not to support it either. They dislike it, but they feel compelled to support it because of the United States' influence on their defense. This is exactly the position Canada finds itself in, with the added layer of vulnerability that most European allies do not share. Canada shares a land border with the United States, and its economy is structurally integrated with the American economy in ways that no European nation is. When Trump threatens a trade war with Spain, Spain can partially shield itself behind the EU's collective trade framework. When Trump threatens Canada, there is no multilateral shield, only the border, the tariffs, and the looming phone call from Mar-a-Lago. Leave a comment below. Do you think Canada made the right call, or has this Prime Minister set a trap he cannot escape? I read every single comment on Sarah Mitchell YouTube channel. Everyone. So where does this leave Canada? In a position that satisfies no one. Critics of the Iran war, many within the Liberal caucus, the NP, and the Canadian public see a prime minister who has abandoned principle for access. The Trump administration views a prime minister who publicly stated that the strikes appear to violate international law, which, if you are in the Oval Office, is not the language of a loyal ally. European counterparts see a Canadian leader whose messaging has been so chaotic and contradictory that it is genuinely difficult to understand Canada's foreign policy position. Meanwhile, the Canadian public, watching missiles fall and airports close, sees their prime minister refusing to rule out sending their sons and daughters to fight in a war he himself suggests may be illegal, receiving very few clear answers. I want to clarify something. There's a version of this story that frames the prime minister as simply a hypocrite, but that does not capture the full picture. He is not a bad man, nor is he an ideologue or a warmonger. He is a brilliant, pragmatic, deeply serious individual trying to navigate an impossible situation in real time, with incomplete information, a trade crisis, a fresh electoral mandate, an active conflict zone containing over 100,000 of his citizens, and the most unpredictable American president in living memory. The mess he has made of Canada's messaging this week is not a character flaw. It is a symptom of the impossible position that Trump has created for every Democratic ally. You either endorse the war and lose your principles, or oppose it and lose your access. In a world where access to the American market is the difference between economic stability and economic devastation, that is not a theoretical dilemma. It is a daily, grinding, impossible political reality. Here is what history will judge. If Canada cannot state that the assassination of a foreign head of state without UN authorization is wrong when the assassin is your ally and the victim is your adversary, then on what basis will Canada ever assert that it is wrong? If the principle only applies to enemies and never to friends, it is not a principle. It is merely loyalty disguised in legal language. The United Nations Charter that Canada is failing to defend was written in 1945 with direct Canadian participation. Canada helped build the post-war world, championed the Ottawa Treaty, advocated for the International Criminal Court, and introduced the concept of the responsibility to protect. The idea that sovereignty cannot shield governments that massacre their own people. These are not mere historical footnotes. They're the foundation of the identity Canada has constructed for itself on the world stage for 80 years. Right now, that foundation is cracking under the weight of a trade deal and a phone call from Florida. I see two paths from here, no middle ground. Path 1. The Prime Minister uses the next 72 hours to articulate a clear, coalition-based, principled middle power position. He builds a coordinated front with Australia, Japan, and the EU, formally and publicly stating that Canada will not participate militarily in any operation not authorized by the United Nations. He absorbs whatever economic pain Trump delivers in response, betting that standing on principle will yield a stronger long-term position with his own citizens, European partners, and even a future American administration. It may cost him and the Canadian economy, but it saves something harder to rebuild: credibility. Path 2. The war drags on, Trump makes the formal request, and the Prime Minister either agrees or says something close enough to an agreement that it functions as a yes. Canadian assets are deployed in some capacity to support a war that the Prime Minister himself has suggested appears to violate international law. The Davos speech becomes a historical footnote, and the precedent set by Crétin in 2003 is not only repeated but inverted. I want to leave you with the questions that truly matter. Is the Prime Minister saving Canada's economy, or is he trading Canada's identity for a trade deal? Can you endorse a war as illegal and still refuse to categorically rule out fighting in it while remaining a credible actor on the world stage? And the underlying question: when the dust settles and the missiles stop falling, which countries will have stood for something and which will have merely survived? That answer may define the next decade of geopolitics. Leave your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. Share this video with someone who needs the full picture, not just the headlines, and subscribe to Sarah Mitchell YouTube channel if you want analysis that goes beyond the surface. The story of Canada, Iran, and Trump is not just Canada's story. It is the story of every country on Earth trying to navigate the complexities of survival.